This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal. Continuing research on Fukushima, I have two experts with me today, I'm very pleased to say. One is Christina Consolo, also known as Rad Chick, and also Lauren Moray from San Francisco, Oakland Bay area, who's an independent geoscientist. Both of them have done extensive work on Fukushima. Christina, let me begin with you. You have had a radio show called Nuked Radio, and you have a website, Fukushima Facts. How did you get drawn into research on this catastrophe?
Well, I noticed early on, after the reactors exploded, we already had symptoms of possible fallout in my area of the country, in southeast Michigan. I had the metallic taste. I noticed a few weeks after that a lot of the pine trees started turning red, and later on that summer I even noticed mutations in some of the plants and young trees that were growing around here, and that's when I really started looking into atmospheric transport and seeing whatever I could find about past nuclear accidents to try to figure out what was happening with this one, because there just was no news about it at all.
Had you done any research on, in this area? I mean, was that anything you'd ever studied in school or whatever?
Well, Chernobyl happened when I was a senior in high school, and we spent quite a bit of time studying it back then, and I was very intrigued by it. And then I have friends and family that work in the nuclear industry, so it's always been kind of part of my life, and I also was a big supporter of it for a while before I really knew the truth of how dangerous these plants were.
Well, it looks to me like you've done quite a lot of research on it. Loren, I know you have been noticing some signs of contamination along the Pacific coast and even in Berkeley and in San Francisco. Can you tell us some of those indications that things are not going well?
Well, I really noticed it at Christmas, this past Christmas of 2012. When I was traveling on public transportation and also walking up and down the sidewalks, seeing people you don't normally see and babies that don't normally come out into the public view. And what I noticed, which was really alarming, is that I saw many indications of birth defects in babies that were born just before or since the Fukushima disaster on March 11th, 2011. And I knew right away, because I was seeing Down syndrome babies and toddlers, babies with defective eye defects, birth defects, and the brain and the eyes develop in the first month, and when an embryo is exposed in that stage, very often the brain and or the eyes are damaged. I also noticed a toddler who'd been born in the month sometime in late February before Fukushima happened, and she was about almost 2 years old, riding on a bus, and I moved around from the seat I was in to be able to face her and her babysitter. And I looked at this baby, and the woman who was taking care of her, an older African-American woman, noticed that, and she said, "This baby is a dwarf. I love her, but she will never be taller than she is now." And I said, "Well, how old is she? When was she born?" And she said late February 2011. So then I knew that radioactive iodine had affected the endocrine system, which is the pituitary, thyroid, and adrenal glands, which control growth, organ function, everything in the body. And I realized that it had to be Fukushima radioactive iodine that had damaged her. So that was particularly important to see these birth defects expressed already a year and a half after Fukushima, because the babies and the unborn are the most susceptible to damage by the ionizing radiation. And what Dr. Levan said, He did a study during bomb testing in Alberta, Canada, and other parts of Canada. But he was writing about the effects and researching the effects of the very large hydrogen bomb tests that the Soviets did in the Arctic. And he reported in this landmark paper that damage to a developing organism, an organism in the developmental stages, has 10 to 1,000,000 times greater damaging effects on that organism than after they're born or they're in later stages of their lives. So the litmus test for ionizing radiation, of course, is the unborn and the babies. And what we're seeing are increases in infant mortality across the U.S. as well as around the world, decreases in fertility, and then very strange things like I've seen 2 cases in the last week of men reported with breast cancer. And one man who lived in Massachusetts, he was in his early 40s and an athlete, had breast cancer twice in both of his breasts. So these are just some of the indications. The environment is also contaminated. There have been reports about radiation levels in dried seaweed, or they call it nori in Japan, in the Chiba area, which is between Tokyo and Fukushima, and also in seaweed off of the West Coast. And we'll talk in more detail during the interview, but we wanted to give you first an update on the Fukushima typhoons. This would be from October 15th to the present, and then compare that to 28 signs we have now that the West Coast is just absolutely getting fried. The West Coast of the Pacific coastline of North America. And we'll just talk about biological effects and the effects on infants, also the environmental effects, and then we'd like to cover this very alarming increase in nuclear power. Who is getting involved now? It's China taking over the British system, and also the fact that Janet Napolitano, who's head of Homeland Security, has now been hired as president of the University of California, which is the biggest weapon of mass destruction producer in the world, and that seems to be on the increase, and no doubt they will be using nuclear weapons, many nuclear weapons, on civilian populations, not only in Iraq and Afghanistan, Lebanon, Gaza, but they're going to be using them in the developed, the superpower countries as well.
Hi, this is Alexander Higgins from the Alexander Higgins blog. I'm making this video. We got some breaking news coming out that really needs to get out to the public. The EPA has been monitoring the United States for contamination blowing over here from Japan. If you weren't aware, it's been blowing over here for a while. EPA has been collecting this data for a few weeks, and they finally decided to put some of it out. And they have detected radiation in the drinking water in 13 U.S. cities. I'm putting this out on video because this is information that needs to get out. The corporate media is not going to make this a headline. Most people are not going to know about this, and it's going to be up to me and you to tell our friends and our families and get this out there by word of mouth. I'm just going to give you a quick rundown of what's been found where. In Los Angeles, the radiation in the milk has been detected above the federal drinking water standards. In Phoenix, radiation in their milk was slightly below the federal drinking water standards. In Boise, Idaho, they've detected the rainwater has radiation 131. They have radiation, 130 times above the federal drinking water standard. They've also detected in that rainwater cesium 13.66 times above the federal drinking water limits. That's the cesium with a 2-year half-life. They found cesium, the 137, with a 30-year half-life at 12 times the federal drinking water limit. In Tennessee, the drinking water there has been detected with iodine radiation that is basically slightly half of the federal drinking water limit. Quick rundown of the states that the EPA is now reporting radiation is in the drinking water is California, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Tennessee, Montana, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, New Jersey, Alabama, and if you weren't aware, it's also been detected in Canada, British Columbia, Vancouver to be exact. So cesium, tellurium, different types of radiation have been detected in Boise, Idaho, Las Vegas, Dutch Harbor, Honolulu, Anaheim, Riverside, San Francisco, San Bernardino, Jacksonville, Orlando, Salt Lake City, Guam, and Sapien. They've also detected uranium-234. This stuff has a half-life of 245,000 years, a little more than that. Brief overview, you can see more details, specifically what the levels were in the drinking water in each of these places, what the levels were in the rainwater in each of these places, what the levels were for the air in each of these places. And like I said, it's going to be really important for you to have this conversation with your friends and family. Let them know, not to spread panic, but the public just needs to be educated on what they can do to limit their exposure to this radiation, because it's something that we have to live with now.
Signs in Michigan already of radioactive contamination. Could you mention a word or two about those?
Oh, absolutely. The first summer, in the summer of 2011, I had been a gardener, an avid gardener, and grown my own produce for 17 years. And I was always interested in mutations because that was my area of expertise was actually in genetics and retinal pathology and clinical research. But I never saw anything in nature, and pretty soon I started seeing it happening in things that grew very fast, things that uptake a lot of water, like dandelions and weeds and young trees and things of that nature. And then when I went back to the Chernobyl research and I learned about, the findings in tree leaves and in flowers and then later in animals, I started a page on Facebook called Mutation Watch, and I put out a call for images to see what people were noticing in their part of the country. And, I get emails every day saying, I've been, growing corn for 30 years and I've never seen anything like this, or I've had these trees on my property my whole life and they've never developed triple and quadruple seedlings. And just all of these changes that are occurring are the exact same thing that happened after Chernobyl and the same thing that happened after 3 Mile Island. And I made the acquaintance of a woman named Mary Osborne, who's known as the mutation lady of 3 Mile Island. And when anyone in that area notices something funny growing in their yard, they call her and she comes over and takes a picture of it. And she's collected thousands of images over the years. And when you put our images next to each other, it's all the same thing. So, in order for this correlation to be incontrovertible, we need to test these plants, but there's no way to test them because the universities are not going to let you just walk in and use their very expensive equipment. And even to test just one small section of a plant would take hours to do. So we're kind of stuck with just collecting images for right now, making those images available to researchers who want to use them in any of the research that they're doing. and just to keep asking the public for data and sourcing as much of that as we can through social media, and in turn, getting the word out with social media as much as possible too, since all of these agencies and organizations that have been set up to protect us and warn us about fallout or other contaminants are not really doing their job, at least from the evidence that we're seeing.
Well, it is stunning, and the fact that these effects are being experienced clear across the country, I mean, from San Francisco, Oakland Bay to Michigan is really stunning all by itself. Lorraine, I know this new study includes a map showing where the contamination is the greatest in the West, that the area of greatest concentration appeared to be Chicago. And I wonder what that means. Have you got an interpretation about why Chicago or that area should be, heavy among the many areas in the country that are being so strongly affected?
Okay, you're referring to the contamination map from the article 28 Signs that the West Coast is being fried?
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, that map is a combined it's a map of combined radiation contamination from different sources. So part of it is the radiation that has been released every day from nuclear power plants across the U.S. So that's why there are more symbols on the eastern half of the U.S. Many of those are nuclear power plants, which have been in operation since the 60s and 70s. But also there is contamination from the military sources, depleted uranium, and so forth on military bases and firing ranges and bombing ranges in the U.S., which that stuff is all over the U.S. Every base is contaminated with it, I think you could say. And, of course, then the rainout and fallout, it's the rainout of the military munitions, radiological and nuclear mini nukes that they've been using in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria and Lebanon and other places. And that comes across the ocean, believe it or not, all the way across the Eurasian continent, over the Pacific, and then it's rained out across the United States and Canada. So that's part of the cause of elevated radiation in the U.S. And then, of course, Fukushima is on top of that. And I think that a lot of the radiation, particularly in the western states and the western slope of the Rocky Mountains, a lot of that is Fukushima. And the very large increase alarming increase in death rates in the U.S., the highest increase is on the west slope of the Rocky Mountains, where rain and snow rains out the radiation transported in air masses from west to east.
Christina, do you have that map in front of you as we speak? Because I want to get your take too on what the distribution shows and whether anything strikes you as especially interesting about this.
I don't have that map. I saw that map. I don't have it right in front of me, but I do know from watching the atmospheric transport, and I was doing a fallout forecast for the first year after the accident, trying to predict where this rainout would occur, and then seeing how it corresponded to these various Geiger networks that had been set up, and we were able to predict in about 90 to 95% of the time where the highest levels would occur. And something that I see that happened on a daily basis was higher levels around the Great Lakes region, and part of that is because of all the humidity from the Great Lakes. Binds with these particles, and they occur with rainout and so forth. And there's in Michigan we have a lot of variance in the weather and in precipitation levels as it is. Being on the east coast of Lake Huron, I know that they get about 4 times the amount of precipitation on the west coast of Ontario, which is across the lake. So we have this lake effect that occurs, and we also see that with snowfall totals in like the Grand Rapids region, which is on the western side of the state, that anywhere around these lakes is going to have a greater potential for fallout because of the amount of humidity and increased precipitation. This is most of the time entirely dependent on where the rain falls and where the snow occurs.
Very
and
good.
Then the Great Lakes watershed is a vast and enormous region with rain out and snow out of all this radiation flowing into the Great Lakes and increasing the levels there. And of course, the water evaporates, it washes up on the shorelines, the radioactive particles are lofted into the air. And we know that the highest cancer rates in studies from England and in the U.S. are along shorelines of lakes, coastlines of geographic areas, and riverbanks.
Well, let me just encourage everyone to pull up the article, 28 Signs the West Coast is being absolutely fried with nuclear radiation from Fukushima, since we're going to be discussing, just as we are now, not only the map, but also the 28 signs, where I'm very keen on getting Loren and Christina's explanations about why those are so significant. But Loren, looking at the map, it seems to me some of the heaviest contamination seems to be at locations like, if I'm not mistaken, Portland, Oregon, San Francisco, possibly it's Los Angeles. More inland, it looks like Albuquerque, it looks like Denver, it looks like, I don't know if that's Austin, Texas. Then there's a real high contamination around what appears to be Orlando. Am I right about those locations?
Those are all either locations where nuclear power plants, nuclear labs are located, and I've collected baby teeth and done studies with the Radiation and Public Health Project around those regions. In the Seattle, the Northwest area, including Portland, the Hanford Nuclear Weapons Lab, which has produced plutonium for decades, has really contaminated the Columbia River with constant releases of radiation that the fish populations are affected. The salmon in the Columbia River have increasing female populations and decreasing male populations, which is happening globally in the human population due to the hormonal and other effects of ionizing radiation on glands. And we have much more intersex now. That's where male and female reproductive cells are mixed in the same organism. That shouldn't be happening. And so polar bears in the Arctic, where the Russians, the Soviets, did nuclear bomb tests, the females look normal and they have cubs with them, but they also have vestigial penises as well as female reproductive organs. There's been a study done at Svalbard in the region of the nuclear bomb tests by the Soviet Union. But it's happening in the human population, and intersex is being reported all over the world in humans. But now we know that polar bears in the Arctic region and seals and walruses also have reported fur loss. They're losing their hair, their fur. They have open sores. The same thing is being reported in the moose population along the Canadian-U.S. border from the Pacific to the Atlantic. So this is radiation damage. Radiation exposure causes these things, and it's also happening to flight crews for Alaska Airlines, to pilots, flying through the contaminated air column. The whole sky, the atmosphere is contaminated all the way up into lower orbital space with this Fukushima very dynamic, very mobile plumes and nanoparticles that just spread all over the world. And by 2020, the entire Pacific Ocean will be contaminated by Fukushima radiation.
It's just dumbfounding. What do you make of these sexual aberrations? I mean, is that because sex chromosomes are particularly sensitive to radiation? Is it just one more manifestation on the order of the birth defects that you're observing showing up with greater frequency in public places? I mean, it's all very profoundly disturbing.
Well, it's because ionizing radiation, and particularly depleted uranium or uranium, is a hormone and an estrogen disruptor. There was a very good study done at the University of New Mexico, very, very good study, and they exposed pregnant female mice to drinking water contaminated with depleted uranium, but at levels that the government says are safe. And it caused birth defects, it caused changes and abnormalities in the uterus, the lining of the uterus. And, of course, that is the main cause of endometriosis in women. It's increased horrendously since bomb testing, particularly around nuclear facilities. So when you change the messenger molecules in the reproductive system, all kinds of strange things happen. This isn't normal. It shouldn't be happening, and men shouldn't have female reproductive cells in them, and women shouldn't have male reproductive cells in them. This is all new, and it's part of the miracle, of the nuclear age. It's a nightmare.
Christina, are you detecting or are there any indications of similar serious sexual abnormalities in Michigan or other areas with which you're acquainted?
Not that I've had time to look into. Of course, it's difficult to find this information because it's not shared freely by the public health departments. But once you understand the way that fallout affects populations from studies that have been done, there were some very good studies that were done in the UK in the 60s about childhood leukemia that was very large in populations where women had had x-rays done during pregnancy, and they found that the earlier in the pregnancy that a pelvic x-ray was performed, the greater likelihood of that baby, just from one x-ray, that baby had a 50% increase in its chance of developing leukemia, kidney cancer, or brain cancer. And the number actually got higher the more x-ray exposure that infant might have had. And the study that was done, they tried to correlate this with fallout, and each bomb test that was done during peacetime it exposed people to approximately one x-ray, or the amount of radiation from one x-ray. But we know just at that low level that it can be extremely damaging from studies that were done back in the 60s. One in particular I'm thinking of, it was from the University of Michigan, that correlated the effect of radioactive iodine in infants compared to adults, and it was, as Loren had said, 10 to 1,000 times higher for infants than adults, and the exposure is greater for inhalation versus external exposure too. So now that we have this ongoing fallout that's coming out in our rains, getting into our food supply, you might only be getting a little bit here and a little bit there, but this is cumulative. And this is going to be going on the rest of our lives and our children's lives, because there's no way to shut off what's going on at that plant.
Yeah,
we have no way to clean up, the three melted fuel cores that are in the ground. and this endless pouring of water. I mean, what this plant has turned into is just a radiological, generating machine, and there's no way to turn it off.
It's just stunning. I'm just, blown away that Japan would go the direction of nuclear energy when it had suffered the nuclear bomb attacks at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I mean, you would have thought there would be a tremendous cultural revulsion against even doing that. And yet they appear to have been sold, a package of how beneficial it would be. Even Einstein said he thought it was, splitting the atom was a ridiculous way to heat a cup of coffee. I mean, to boil water. I mean, I really do think that the nuclear energy industry has abdicated its responsibility. And of course, we all know about the terrible problem of nuclear waste, which has never been resolved, and where, Loren, you may have mentioned recently how the situation in Washington is catastrophic because there seems to be all of this nuclear waste that's heading toward an aquifer. It may have been Maya Madison in an interview we did just this past week with whom I was discussing, but all of this is terribly disturbing.
Yeah, what I wanted to mention to add to what Christina presented on the sexual effects of ionizing radiation is that in September of 2007, the United States Geological Survey, the USGS, published a paper, peer-reviewed, and it was a fish study across the entire United States on intersex in fish populations. And what they did was they sampled rivers all over the U.S., and they took the male fish and investigated the reproductive tissues to see how many of the fish, what percentage in each particular population sample expressed intersex, and that's where the male and female reproductive cells are mixed in the same organism. And what they reported was every sample that they collected in the United States had levels of intersex in the male fish population, ranging from low levels up to 95% of the males in the sample. Across the entire U.S., there was only one river where the male fish did not express intersex at some level, and that was the Yukon River in Alaska.
Christina, do you think that there's a political dimension of this, that the government feels there's nothing the government can do, so it's not going to warn the population because it might generate hysteria? I mean, is that the sort of reasoning that may be taking place at the highest levels? Because our government has to be aware of the scientific facts that Loren is relating here. They're simply not sharing them with the public.
Oh, sure. And what's been, suggested to me during bomb testing is that, they knew what the explosions would do. What they wanted to find out is what it would do to the downwind population. And if you read books like Secret Fallout by Dr. Ernest Sternglass, he talks about how people in the areas where they were conducting nuclear weapons tests, the government would give the people free car washes, and they would measure the cars for contamination before the wash and afterward because they wanted to see how successful decontamination would be. We're being experimented on, and the only thing that's being controlled about this accident is us. Our government's well aware of the research, and back since the 1920s, we've known that even low levels of radiation greatly disrupts DNA. And they've continued to introduce this into our environment, and whether it is to make a sick population that will then, the healthcare industry will be able to generate more revenue from, or if it's for control reasons. I don't know as much about that as Loren does from the historical or political perspective.
Well,
But it's just so obvious that you're right that we are being used as experimental subjects, but without our consent. So this is a gross violations of the ethics for experimentation with human subjects, which the government, of course, its own agencies are supposed to be upholding, but in fact the government itself is grossly violating.
well, 85% of the key positions in the U.S. government are held by Skull and Bones men from Yale, and Skull and Bones leads us directly to the London financiers and the Anglo-American Permanent War Crimes Racketeering Syndicate.
So you're suggesting that Yale and Skull and Bones are really a conduit for producing intel operatives and corrupt officials for the American government to maintain its course in relation with DHS, Homeland Security, the CIA, and so forth.
I think that there's plenty of evidence that has been, out in the public venue that supports that. But I'd like to go back to the bomb testing effects. Now, Christina said, of course, the government knew, and I'd just like to provide some evidence that supports what she's saying. In the later 2000s, I was testifying in the Nevada legislature and working as a research staff scientist at the Lawrence Livermore Nuclear Weapons Lab, and we were studying the metal canisters and doing pilot studies in New Mexico and in Nevada on storing nuclear waste in this special metal alloy cans. And I met a woman who was actually a Rothschild. She told me secretly, but not to tell anyone. And she was very impressed with the work I was doing. So she went to all of the meetings there in Coverup, which is a little tiny town near the Nevada test site. And she found out that the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, actually had a secret dairy at the Nevada test site all through nuclear bomb testing. And they were measuring the radiation in cows, in calves, and in their own workers who shoveled manure and fed the cattle in that dairy. They also had cattle herds, meat-producing herds that they were also testing, and that was classified. But she went to town, and she actually got the report declassified and gave it to me. Another piece of evidence is that cattle mutilation during bomb testing began to be reported, and it really turned into a very big issue in the U.S. And what a radiation activist told me was that he walked into an office one day in the Midwest, another activist office, about this cattle mutilation. And they had a stick pin map where they had put a stick pin for each cattle mutilation reported across the U.S. He said they were all downriver or downwind from nuclear facilities. And the sheriff in one county actually went up to a black helicopter that had landed at a very tiny airport out in the wildlands, the farmland, and discovered it was Army personnel with samples of tissue from cattle. They'd mutilated cattle in that area. And it was the Army taking samples from horses, cattle, killing them, and then throwing them out of the helicopter after they sampled them, or leaving them on the ground smelling like formaldehyde. And this has been a military operation the whole time to monitor the health effects, the radiation levels, and the samples were always taken in the cattle from the eyeballs, that usually has the lowest radiation level in the body from the rectum and different organs in the cattle. It was very systematic. We also know that what happened in the bomb test period is happening now to monitor the Fukushima radiation. And what they're doing is there's a big effort by the military and the nuclear establishment to manipulate the vital statistics of the U.S. and other countries by secretly aborting, forcing women with defective fetuses to abort them. And then it's reported in the vital statistics to the Centers for Disease Control from each county as voluntary abortions by these women. And that keeps the birth defects and so forth out of the vital statistics at the Centers for Disease Control. And of course, these statistics are used globally. So they're fudging everything.
So these are feti that actually are suffering serious genetic abnormalities, but they're
Yes.
covering it by...
And they have special units now set up in the county hospitals where they're sending poor women, Native Americans, African American women, poor people, and forcing them to have abortions because the food streams in the United States into different populations and different socioeconomic groups are also contaminated with radiation. The highest levels are in the poor populations, the poor sector of minorities and poor people. And the best food, the cleanest food, for instance, you can buy at Whole Foods, where they are importing food from the Southern Hemisphere, and they always have been since they went into operation and became a corporation and a food provider for the U.S. So food streams are also being poisoned.
Well, it's just stunning. There are those, of course, who surmise that this is actually something that's being allowed to happen in order to contribute to the depopulation of the world. And, you know, one might think that presumes a rather cynical point of view, but the government really doesn't seem to be doing anything that it could do to protect the interests, the health and welfare of the population, the citizens of the United States in this instance.
Well, it's hard to believe. It's really, really surreal. It's Orwellian. It's a nightmare. But a very, very interesting book has been published called Political Ponerology. And ponerology is the science, it's a science on the nature of evil. This particular book is addressing political purposes, political ponerology. And it's by Andrew Lobachevsky, who died recently, but he and a group of scientists in Poland wrote this book about the evil politicians during the Soviet era. The book had to be burned by him because he was told that the Polish intelligence was coming to his house to take it. And he and some of the scientists moved to the Soviet Union, rewrote it, published it. The same thing happened there. He came to the U.S. and he finally published it in his late 80s in the U.S. in about 1985 or 90. But Brzezinski blocked it from being published. It's finally been published, and if people are interested in how things like this can happen to humanity and to the biosphere and to this planet, it's a very, very interesting book.
And Loren, on that note, we're going to have to take our break. This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, with my two very special guest experts on Fukushima, Christina Consolo and Loren Moray. Will be right back. This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, continuing and concluding my conversation with Loren Moret and Christina Consolo about Fukushima. I really am at your disposal because the two of you are the experts. I know we want to address the 28 indications that the West Coast is being fried with nuclear radiation, but I leave it to your discretion as to how we shall proceed. Loren?
We have we have this article and other articles. We'll send it all to you, and you can weave it into the interview.
Yes, well, Bill Fox, to whom I'm very indebted for arranging these interviews, will be preparing transcripts of our conversations for publications as articles in Veterans Today, and he would be very pleased to include the links to any articles you want to add, Loren, and of course any graphics you want to provide for the publication in VT.
Sure. Okay, Christina, how about if we each read one of these 28 signs on the Pacific coast of North America?
Sure.
So the first one, which we mentioned already, is polar bears, seals, and walruses along the Alaska coastline suffering from fur loss and open sores, and that's also been reported in the moose population. There's a big moose die-off from the Pacific coast to the Atlantic along the Canadian-U.S. border. So you go ahead and do number 2.
Number 2 was the epidemic of sea lion deaths along the California coastline. But I also want to mention that they had an unusual event as far down as San Diego this year, where seal pups were being abandoned in much greater numbers than what the rescues were used to seeing. And they still don't have an explanation about why these seal pups were abandoned. They were all underweight, and some of them have been rehabilitated and put back into nature. But these events are really escalating. They're moving right up the coast.
Could it be that from the evolutionary point of view, the seal population, the mothers recognize when they have offspring that aren't likely to be capable of sustaining their way, and therefore they abandon them early to not invest more maternal resources in their upbringing when their prospects are so slender?
Yeah, that's a definite possibility.
The other thing that happens is that when a population is put under stress, and the young are affected the most by toxins and so forth, and it weakens them and they can't keep up with the mothers, or they get lost or left behind. The mothers just can't take care of them or find them when they come back to where they thought they were. So 45% of the pups born in June have died in Southern California along the coast. That's a very high death rate. It's the same as the infant mortality. And when you see phenomena occurring in humans and in animal populations, it has to be an environmental cause.
Yeah, it's all profoundly disturbing.
Continue. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, so did you have anything else to say, Christina?
No, I did try to track someone down at NOAA to comment on the seal mortality and what was found in terms of the testing for radioactive materials, because Any News had reported over a year ago that they did find radiation in the seals, but that it wasn't above what they expected it to be for normal background. However, they never indicated if it was cesium or strontium or what they tested for and what the levels were. And when I tried to call NOAA to pin somebody down with this, I got such a runaround. In fact, some of it I did on air on my show, and we kept getting sent to David Kelly, and then I would call David Kelly and say, oh, you want the David Kelly in Hawaii? And then I would call him, and they would send me to someone else. And what I found out was that they actually carved up these seals and sent them to 20 different labs for testing. You know, they sent the whiskers to one lab, and they sent the teeth to another lab, and they sent the skin from the dorsal area to another lab. And so, I mean, they're kind of doing, it's like the Manhattan Project, but in a
Same
reverse.
thing. It's the same thing.
Where they divide up all the information, knowing these people probably won't talk to each other and figure out what's going on.
Yeah, that's what they're doing. So number 3 is that along the Pacific coast of Canada and the Alaska coastline, the population of sockeye salmon is at a historic low. Many are blaming Fukushima, and certainly this woman, she's a professional biologist, has fundraised and done a study on the salmon in British Columbia, in the Fraser River and other rivers. And this is an area where a large orca population will summer. The resident orcas that live in a particular area, they come and migrate and spend the whole summer there, and they usually arrive with new baby orcas, so they're feeding them too. They live on salmon populations. The other orcas that are called transient populations, they live on marine sea mammals, and they travel in groups of 3 so that they're quiet and they can sneak up on the sea mammals, seals and stuff. And so they have very different diets, and we're going to see the effects of the radiation and the difference in the diet in these populations over time. And I predict that the coastal salmon, the resident populations, are going to have a more severe impact because the salmon are going out in the Pacific. They're eating smaller fish. It bioconcentrates the radiation. And we just have to wait and see. But this woman who did the study and independently raised the money to have these salmon lab analyzed, they have very severe viruses, and that indicates immune system damage, as well as a slimy starfish goo. The starfish are just kind of melting along the North Pacific coast.
Oh, God.
And then the jellyfish also. So that really sounds like a viral infection or some kind of a bacterial viral slime on them.
But, the exposure to radiation will affect their immune systems or their capacity to cope with otherwise, threats to their environment they might normally be able to deal with, and therefore make them far more vulnerable to these kinds of diseases and related problems.
Number 4 was something is causing fish all along the west coast of Canada to bleed from their gills, bellies, and eyeballs. I mean, bleeding and bruising is a hallmark of radiation exposure. I'm sure there's mutations of viruses and bacteria that could be making these fish sick. They're indicating from this article that it's in multiple species. Now, I did call several fisheries over the last few days in Canada, one in the Great Lakes region, Purdy's, and another in the Vancouver area. And both of the people that I spoke to at those fisheries were very forthcoming. They all knew about Fukushima. They knew that there was a potential for it to be affecting their catches. They did report from both the Great Lakes region and from BC that they're experiencing lows in their catch. Nothing historic, but that it was kind of across the board. But neither organization had noted any increase of disease. And when I asked them who's testing the fish for radiation, they said that wasn't their job. That happened after the fish leave their marketplace.
After the fish leave their marketplace.
Yeah. So
they're getting into the food chain for the human population, and only then they're going to be tested? Not likely, because the retailers are going to want to market it and make their profit. I mean, no one cares about the health of the consumer.
Well,
Right.
they don't just balkanize countries, they balkanize the media too. So that's what's happening.
It all needs to be tested, and Loren had brought up in an interview that she did last week with Alfred Weber that, I mean, there's a serious economic impact to this disaster that we're just now starting to realize, and obviously it's going to be, you know, affecting the fishing industry pretty severely.
Just as has happened in the Gulf Coast from the BP disaster. I mean, it's just wiped out whole industries there. It's
Right.
But what they're doing is they're out there fishing like mad. They're scraping the bottom. They have these huge nets that are a mile wide. They're just taking everything indiscriminately, and feeding it, and turning it in, counting it, freezing it, and turning it into human food. This is just how they spread the radiation everywhere. They want everyone exposed. Just exactly what they're doing in Japan by burning radioactive trash all over Japan. Number 5 is a vast field of radioactive debris from Fukushima that is approximately the size of California or Texas, as crossing the Pacific Ocean. It's already crossed, and it's starting to collide with the West Coast.
that's
So
stunning. That's stunning.
that's right. And there's a very good article, October 18th, by Greg Ray in the Herald newspaper in Australia. It's called "The Ocean is Broken." And this is by a sailor who made many trips, yacht races across the Pacific. And what he's saying now, he sailed his boat from Osaka to San Francisco recently. He said, quote, "The next leg of the long voyage was from Osaka to San Francisco. And for most of that trip, the desolation was tinged with nauseous horror and a degree of fear." He said, "After we left Japan, it felt as if the ocean itself was dead. We hardly saw any living things. We saw one whale, sort of rolling helplessly on the surface with what looked like a big tumor on its head. It was pretty sickening. I've done a lot of miles on the ocean in my life, and I'm used to seeing turtles, dolphins, sharks, and big flurries of feeding birds. But this time, for 3,000 nautical miles, there was nothing alive to be seen. In place of the missing life was garbage in astounding volumes. In a lot of places, we couldn't start out our motor for fear of entangling the propeller in the massive pieces of rope and cable. That's an unheard of situation out in the ocean. If we did decide to motor, we couldn't do it at night, only in the daytime with a lookout on the bow watching for rubbish. On the bow, in the waters above Hawaii, you could see right down into the depths. I could see that the debris isn't just on the surface, it's all the way down. And it's all sizes, from a soft drink bottle to pieces the size of a big car or truck. We saw a factory chimney sticking out of the water with some kind of boiler thing still attached below the surface. We saw a big container type thing just rolling over and over on the waves. We were reeving around these pieces of debris. It was like sailing through a garbage pile.
Unbelievable.
That is reality. That is what is happening.
Number 6, it is being projected that the radioactivity off coastal waters off the U.S. West Coast could double over the next 5 to 6 years.
I'll bet sooner.
I think that's being pretty generous. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it's going to happen sooner,
That's
and
much
there's
too conservative.
many different things that need to be taken into account. How much radioactivity might be carried from this debris. Much of it is porous cloth and styrofoam and wood that's going to collect particles that have been raining out over the past 2.5 years. And then we also have a situation of uranium buckyballs, and now the newest finding, cesium buckyballs. That was just reported today. Loren can explain a little bit more about that, but we don't know how those things travel in the ocean waters.
Yes, scientists are reporting that spheres of radioactive material from Fukushima are being reported for the first time. Ball-like particles composed of cesium, iron, zinc, solid and insoluble in water. Impact on human health needs to be examined. What they're talking about are nanoparticles, and they are produced, these spherical particles. I know all about this because depleted uranium is just like this. And this indicates, since these are being reported now very recently as a new phenomenon, it means that the fuel rods are burning in Fukushima at extremely high temperatures. It means there's no water in the pools or some of the pools. And what happens at these very high temperatures is that they're so high, the burning fuel rods it release a gas, a very hot gas, that condenses and collects as a spherical radioactive particle when the very hot gas begins to chill. That indicates that Fukushima fuel rods are definitely burning at extremely high temperatures, and that was not reported right after the Fukushima earthquake and tsunami. So that place is going in flames and releasing extremely radioactive, very, very dangerous spherical nanoparticles of mixed radioactive isotopes. And those tiny spheres are extremely dangerous because they have an effect called the particulate effect. They are they actually change chemicals and interfere with cell processes that are life-threatening and cause very high rates of various illnesses caused by ionizing radiation. But there is our proof right there that Fukushima is on fire.
Unbelievable.
I have a question. Loren, have you ever heard of this type of nanoparticle before in a reactor accident?
No, but
I hadn't either.
No, I haven't either, but it's definitely a characteristic of depleted uranium, from the battlefield. Uranium is a pyrophoric metal. It catches on fire very, very easily, and it burns at temperatures up to 5,000 degrees centigrade, which is hotter than the sun. So these tiny particles are the most lethal part of the danger of a nuclear power plant burning or using depleted uranium weapons. And of course, we know at Fukushima that they have MOX fuel in one of the reactors. That's mixing plutonium and uranium in the fuel, and it's very unstable, and it burns at very high temperatures. And of course, plutonium is extremely lethal to living organisms.
Number 7, experts have found very high levels of cesium-137 in plankton living in the waters of the Pacific Ocean between Hawaii and the West Coast.
Oh, that isn't normal, huh?
Well, they detected 2 weeks after the accident already very high levels in the kelp off BC. And at that time it was iodine-131, I believe, which after 40 days dissipates. But 129 sticks around for much longer. I have an article called The Bioaccumulation of Contamination in Plankton. This is from the U.S. Armed Forces in 1955. Plankton concentrate mineral elements from the water, and it has been found that radioactivity may be concentrated in this manner by as much as 1,000 times. Thus, for example, 1 gram of plankton could contain 1,000 times as much radioactivity as a gram of water adjacent to it.
Unreal.
And I believe we know even more now than we did back then, but I mean, this is bad news for anything in the ocean that lives on plankton, which is everything, but things that feed directly on it, like whales, for instance.
It's the base of the food chain, and what we know about bioaccumulation in seaweed is that seaweed bioconcentrates ionizing radiation in the seawater to 150,000 times higher levels in seaweed than in the water the seaweed is living in.
Unbelievable.
So number
8
is one test in California found that 15 out of 15 bluefin tuna were contaminated with radiation from Fukushima. That was just about a year ago when tuna off the coast of San Diego were sampled, and I think all of them had cesium in the flesh, and these tuna had come from Japan, which is where they spawn offshore from Fukushima.
Yeah, number 9 ties into that too. Back in 2012, the Vancouver Sun reported cesium-137 being found in a very high percentage of the fish that Japan was selling to Canada. 73% of the mackerel tested, 91% of the halibut, 92% of the sardines. Of course, now the sardines from here have disappeared. 93% of the tuna and eel, 94% of the cod and anchovies, and 100% of the carp, seaweed, shark, and monkfish.
100%.
100%, and that is because the levels in these different fish depend on their diet. So fish that prey on other fish usually have lower levels than fish that feed on plankton, for instance, or their bottom feeders, and they pick up mud and small particles which have higher levels of radiation because of the chemical affinity that tiny particles have for radiation. In other words, very tiny clay particles in water are they are scavengers for highly charged radioactive particles. 10. Canadian authorities are finding extremely high levels of nuclear radiation in certain fish samples, and that's some fish samples they tested have very high levels of radiation. One sea bass sample collected in July, for example, had 1,000 becquerels. That means disintegrations per second per kilogram of cesium. Now, the terrible thing about cesium is that it affects the heart. It is collected in the heart, and the heart produces new cells only about 5% per year. So we're seeing athletes, racehorses, celebrities during performance, pilots while they're flying are collapsing, they're dying of heart attacks or cardiac failure, and this is being very widely reported in the U.S. and Alaska flight crews, and also in England in football players, racehorses. It's that's the cesium damage. Now, what people don't realize is that nearly 2,000 radioactive isotopes are produced in a fissioning process, and that's what's coming out of burning and coming out of the fuel rods. So you have to multiply that the danger of the cesium they're reporting by almost 2,000 other isotopes. We're getting absolutely bombarded.
If I pick up on number 11, people developing cancer from eating contaminated fish, what I'm stunned by this is that it seems to be having such a rapid effect. I mean, here we have this Daniel Hirsch, a nuclear policy lecturer at UC Santa Cruz, who's telling Global Security Newswire we could have large numbers of cancer from ingestion of fish, and I take it they're already showing up.
It's already showing up.
I mean, how quickly? You know, it's just astonishing that it should be that fast.
Well, you know, part of the problem too is that when you look back at Chernobyl, in Japan they're saying right now all these kids that they're finding thyroid problems with, you know, they're developing nodules, some of them have early cancer. The experts are saying, wow, well, this can't be from Fukushima because it's happening too fast. Because in Chernobyl, it took 4 or 5 years for 100 kids to have cancer.
Well, it's these very tiny particles, and it's constant exposure now for 2 years, more than 2 years. And Fukushima, Chernobyl was just one exposure, and they put the lid on it, they put a sarcophagus on it and stopped it. This is constant daily 24-hour-a-day releases of low-level and not so low-level radiation. And by April of 2011, just 2 months after Fukushima, air samples and air filters in cars were analyzed by Dr. Chris Busby. And he calculated that by April, the radiation concentrations in the air in Japan around the Fukushima area indicated that the equivalent of 300 Chernobyls had occurred. We're talking now, from this new evidence about spherical particles, we're talking about all those fuel rods or large numbers of fuel rods in the cooling pools that are now empty, are releasing huge new amounts of extremely toxic sphericals.
Unbelievable.
So it's really bad, and a new study by the Food Lab and Radiation Food Lab, I believe it's in Japan, they reported that the 19th of October 2013, that Pacific Coast seaweed is contaminated with cesium, and that the levels are 8.14 becquerels per kilo for cesium-134, 8.88 becquerels per kilo for cesium-137, and cobalt is even being reported in seaweed off the Pacific coast of the U.S. At 3.7 becquerels per kilo. In Chiba, which is north, it's between Tokyo and Fukushima, the cesium levels were 41 becquerels per kilo for cesium-134, 63 becquerels per kilo for cesium-137, although no cobalt-60 was detected. But there's nothing to compare this to. You can't even compare it to Chernobyl. It's the spent fuel rods did not burn at Chernobyl. It was just the reactor rods, and they stopped it right away. But these people in Japan are releasing, they're guaranteeing, they're facilitating increased releases of extremely high levels of radiation on a daily basis into the atmosphere and into the ocean. And of course, contaminated air masses are over here along the Pacific coastline in a matter of days.
Number 12 is the BBC News recently reported radiation levels around Fukushima are 18 times higher than previously believed. And, you know, again, it's TEPCO's numbers, which are always revised higher. And with the last few weeks where we've had kind of this escalation of events, one of the things that I found really curious is that because of a wall that was built underground to block the corium from going out into the sea, or highly contaminated water going out into the sea. Effectively, they've dammed up the site so that the ground is now becoming saturated. And if you have this underground, corium lava field under the reactors, you have groundwater that's flowing through the site, and you have water that's continuously being poured on the reactors, and they're only collecting 300 or 400 tons of that a day. I think what we're going to see eventually is that this corium groundwater combination is going to be coming up around the site, and at that point workers aren't going to be able to be there. There's no way to protect them, especially from tritium, because tritium will go through everything. So they're really under the gun for anything that they need to do, and they're going to cycle through workers continuously. There's no way to keep people on the site for long term with the kind of exposures they're getting with these numbers that we're seeing.
Lauren, how about 15, 16, 17?
At this point, 300 tons of contaminated water is pouring into the Pacific Ocean from Fukushima every single day, and that's because Japan is an island arc. The nuclear plants are built on the coastline so they can use seawater, huge amounts of water every day to cool the reactors. And the runoff from the volcanic spine of Japan is running right down to the coastline, and it's washing straight through Fukushima in that location, and just carrying, it's a constant river of radioactive water washing into the sea. Number 16, a senior researcher of marine chemistry at the Japan Meteorological Agency's Meteorological Research Institute says that, quote, 30 billion becquerels of radioactive cesium and 30 billion becquerels of radioactive strontium are being released into the Pacific Ocean from Fukushima every single day. And I bet it's a lot more than that. Number 17, according to TEPCO, a total of somewhere between 20 trillion and 40 trillion becquerels of radioactive tritium. Radioactive tritium is it's radioactive water, basically, have gotten into the Pacific Ocean since the Fukushima disaster first began.
Christina, 18, 19, 20.
According to a professor at Tokyo University, 3 gigabecquerels of cesium-137 are flowing into the port at Fukushima Daiichi every single day. Again, that's just one isotope. It's just cesium-137. Number 19, it's been estimated that up to 100 times as much nuclear radiation has been released into the ocean from Fukushima than was released during the entire Chernobyl disaster. Lauren just covered that when she talked about Chris Busby's air filter studies. And
that's underestimation.
Yeah.
20.
20 is one recent study concluded that a very large plume of cesium-137 from the Fukushima disaster will start flowing into U.S. coastal waters early next year. Ocean simulations showed the plume of radioactive cesium released by the Fukushima disaster could begin flowing into the U.S. coastal waters starting early 2014 and peak in 2016. And again, there's so many unknowns.
It's going to kill the ocean. It absolutely is, the coastline.
Lorraine, go to 21 and 22.
Okay, 21, it is being projected that significant levels of cesium-137 will reach every corner of the Pacific Ocean by the year 2020. That's because the ocean is very dynamic, and that stuff is spread all over very rapidly, but not as rapidly as in the atmosphere. 22, it is being projected that the entire Pacific Ocean will soon have cesium levels 5 to 10 times higher than what we witnessed during the era of heavy atomic bomb testing in the Pacific many decades ago. That's going to absolutely kill the fish populations.
Christina, 23, 24.
The immense amounts of nuclear radiation getting into the water in the Pacific has caused environmental activist Joe Martino to issue the following warning: your days of eating Pacific Ocean fish are over. I mean, mine were over 2 years ago.
Smart. You were ahead of the curve.
24 is the iodine-131, cesium-137, and strontium-90 that are constantly coming from Fukushima are going to affect the health of those living in the northern hemisphere for a very, very long time. Just consider what Harvey Wasserman had to say about this. Iodine-131, for example, can be ingested into the thyroid where it emits beta particles that damage tissue. A plague of damaged thyroids has already been reported by as many as 40% of the children in the Fukushima area. That percentage can only go higher. In developing youngsters, it can stunt both physical and mental growth. Among adults, it causes a wide range of ancillary ailments, including cancer. Cesium-137 has been found in fish caught as far away as California. It spreads throughout the body but tends to accumulate in the muscles. Strontium-90's half-life is around 29 years. It mimics calcium and goes to our bones.
Loren, 25 and 26.
25. According to a recent Planet InfoWars report, the California coastline is being transformed into a dead zone. The California coastline is becoming like a dead zone. And if you go to the beach, you will see that the rocks are unnaturally clean. There's hardly any kelp, barnacles, sea urchins anymore.
Killing all the microscopic forms of life.
Yes, and the tide pools are similarly devoid of crabs, snails, and other scurrying signs of life. In other words, these filter feeders that are taking in very high levels and bioconcentrating them are just not able to survive. And especially compared to 10 to 15 years ago when, you had to wear tennis shoes if you went to the beach, or you'd cut the heck out of the bottom of your feet. Life is being exterminated. The ocean is going extinct.
Unbelievable.
And then it's carried into the Atlantic Ocean, and it will happen there, in the Arctic Ocean, and around the Antarctic. They're killing the entire global oceans.
26.
26 is a study conducted last year came to the conclusion that radiation from the Fukushima disaster could negatively affect human life along the west coast of North America from Mexico to Alaska for decades.
Loren, 27.
According to the Wall Street Journal, it's being projected that the cleanup of Fukushima could take up to 40 years to complete. It's never going to stop releasing in our lifetimes.
I agree. 28, Christina.
Yale professor Charles Perrow is warning that if the cleanup of Fukushima is not handled with 100% precision, that humanity could be threatened for thousands of years. And he is referring to the fuel extraction in part, which is scheduled to start in 15 days from reactor 4. They actually are currently moving the fuel from reactor 6 into the common spent fuel pool. Now, they began that in mid-October, but it took them 3 weeks just to pry off the reactor lid in reactor 6, and that reactor was supposed to be fine. It didn't have any damage that was reported, and if they found anything once they got inside that reactor, they haven't talked about it, but they're currently moving that fuel, and they're going to be moving the fuel from number 4 at the same time and around the end of November.
In the minutes we have that remain, I'd like your concluding reflections, Christina.
Well, I think this is an issue of enormous complexity, and it's difficult to really wrap your mind around it, even if you do nothing else but read about this problem day after day. And I know many people that have. Fukushima's changed their lives because they realized right from the beginning the magnitude of the disaster. And for people who are kind of overwhelmed by this, it's the only thing you have to remember is that all radiation is bad, and everything that you can do to eliminate it in your daily life is good for the long run because it's cumulative, and you kind of have to treat yourself like you're already a cancer patient and get lots of sleep and eat well and pay attention to the people who are talking about this, because it really is probably the most important issue that we've ever faced.
Loren, summing up in a sentence or two.
Well, the effects of these nuclear technologies that have been introduced one after another, it's actually resulted in a very strange phenomenon, and that is that the oldest people in the U.S., the seniors and those over 60, are the healthiest part of the U.S. population now. And the younger populations are having worse and worse health histories and health effects. And as time goes on and they become adults, all that exposure in the womb is expressed later on in their health. And the highest increase in death rates after Fukushima was reported in basically are the soldiers who returned to Texas from the battlefields of Iraq and Afghanistan. They're the most exposed. They're already carrying a body burden that's almost killed them. And that little bit of Fukushima radiation just was the last straw. And so
Lorette Moray and Christina Consolo, I can't thank you enough for being here on The Real Deal with me, even though what you're telling us is overwhelming, depressing, even catastrophic. I can't thank you enough.